Tonight, Apex Crime Files reconstructs the decisions, the reported warnings, the operational controversy, and the unanswered questions that continue fueling public scrutiny around one of the most debated missing persons cases online. And it all appears to begin days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. 3 days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, a decision inside the Pima County Sheriff's Department reportedly triggered concerns that, at the time, likely seemed administrative, internal, temporary, the kind of disagreement most people outside law enforcement would never hear about. But after what happened next, public discussions would begin revisiting that decision with growing intensity. Because according to reports and online discussions surrounding the case, Sheriff Chris Nanos had reassigned veteran surveillance pilot Richard Hossler away from aviation duties and into street patrol only days before Nancy vanished. And critics would later question the timing. At the center of the controversy was not simply a staffing change, but what some believe the reassignment may have affected operationally. Hossler was reportedly one of the department's most experienced aviation personnel, a pilot tied closely to nighttime aerial surveillance operations involving sophisticated infrared imaging technology used during searches across the Arizona desert. To the public, the reassignment may have sounded routine at first. Personnel shifts happen constantly in law enforcement agencies. But according to reports that later surfaced online, the situation allegedly became far more serious behind the scenes. A grievance was reportedly filed. According to public discussions surrounding the case, the grievance allegedly warned that removing Hossler from aviation operations could leave Pima County without dedicated nighttime aerial surveillance capability. Public conversations later focused heavily on that allegation because of what the department's aircraft was reportedly capable of doing. If this timeline unsettles you, you're not alone. Because for many people following the Nancy Guthrie case, the questions didn't begin after she disappeared, they began before. Subscribe to Apex Crime Files as we continue breaking down the decisions, warnings, and unanswered moments that still haunt this investigation. The sheriff's surveillance plane, often discussed online under the name Survey 1, was described as one of the county's most advanced aerial search assets. Reports and discussions surrounding the aircraft referenced infrared thermal imaging systems capable of detecting heat signatures in darkness, aerial tracking technology, and long-duration nighttime search capability across difficult terrain. Supporters of the aviation unit reportedly viewed it as a critical tool during emergencies and missing persons operations. And according to reports, concerns about losing that capability were allegedly raised before anything happened to Nancy Guthrie. Not after, before. That distinction would later become central to public scrutiny surrounding the case. According to discussions that emerged online after Nancy's disappearance, Sheriff Chris Nanos reportedly denied the grievance and moved forward with the reassignment. No public evidence suggests the decision was connected to Nancy Guthrie or that anyone inside the department anticipated the events that would soon follow. But for critics, the controversy surrounding the reassignment became difficult to separate from the timeline that came next, because only days later, the county would find itself searching for a missing 84-year-old woman. And suddenly, earlier decisions no longer felt isolated. Public discussions later focused heavily on the sequence of events leading into the disappearance. Why reduce nighttime aerial capability days earlier? Was the operational risk underestimated? Did leadership believe the capability was unnecessary at the time? Or had an internal disagreement unintentionally weakened an important search resource shortly before a major missing persons case emerged? Those questions would spread rapidly online. Importantly, there is no public evidence establishing that the reassignment affected the outcome of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Search operations are unpredictable, and even advanced technology offers no guarantee of success. But true crime cases are often shaped as much by timing and perception as by confirmed facts. And the timing here would continue drawing attention. Because according to reports and online commentary, this controversy existed before Nancy disappeared. That detail became deeply unsettling for many observers following the case. The idea that warnings may have been raised beforehand created a narrative that felt larger than a routine personnel dispute. In online discussions, some people questioned whether the department fully appreciated the operational consequences of the reassignment. Others argued that hindsight was unfairly transforming an unrelated internal conflict into something more sinister simply because the case remained unresolved. But the questions continued. Why was the reassignment necessary at that specific moment? Why did concerns about nighttime surveillance reportedly fail to alter the decision? If the warnings were truly raised beforehand, were they fully understood? Or was this simply a tragic coincidence that later became magnified through public speculation? Those uncertainties became part of the emotional gravity surrounding the case. Because the controversy surrounding the reassignment did not emerge after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. According to reports, it was already unfolding quietly inside the department before the search ever began. And once the disappearance captured public attention, every earlier detail suddenly carried new weight. Online investigators and commentators began revisiting the timeline repeatedly. The reassignment, the grievance, the alleged warning about surveillance capability, the timing. Each piece began feeding a broader narrative about preparedness, leadership decisions, and whether critical operational capacity had been reduced shortly before the county faced a major crisis. Again, no public evidence supports theories of intentional wrongdoing by Sheriff Chris Nanos or anyone inside the department. But critics continued questioning whether the situation reflected deeper operational instability inside the sheriff's office at the time. That distinction matters, because the public conversation was not necessarily driven by proof. It was driven by possibility. The possibility that important warnings may not have received enough attention. The possibility that critical capability may have been altered at the wrong moment. The possibility that decisions made quietly days earlier suddenly became impossible to ignore after Nancy vanished. And that is what transformed the reassignment into something much larger than an internal staffing dispute. For some observers, it became symbolic. Symbolic of warnings allegedly dismissed. Symbolic of operational vulnerability. Symbolic of a department that, according to critics, may already have been dealing with internal tension before the disappearance occurred. Whether those interpretations are fair remains heavily debated. But the questions surrounding the timeline have never fully disappeared. Because long before the public began analyzing search efforts, surveillance systems, and investigative missteps, another controversy was already unfolding quietly behind the scenes. Then, only days later, an 84-year-old woman disappeared. According to reports and public discussions surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case, the controversy involving the Pima County Sheriff's Department did not begin with the disappearance itself. By the time Nancy vanished, some observers believe tensions surrounding the department's aerial surveillance capability were already quietly building behind the scenes. And at the center of those discussions was a reported warning that, in hindsight, many online commentators say now feels impossible to ignore. Days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, veteran surveillance pilot Richard Hossler was reportedly reassigned out of aviation operations and into street patrol following what multiple discussions described as an internal disagreement within the department. On its own, the move may not have seemed unusual to the public. Personnel disputes happen inside law enforcement agencies constantly. Reassignments happen. Leadership disagreements happen. But according to reports later circulated online, this reassignment allegedly triggered immediate operational concern. A formal grievance was reportedly filed. That grievance would later become one of the most heavily discussed pre-disappearance events connected to the case. According to public discussions and commentary surrounding the situation, the grievance allegedly warned that removing Hossler from aviation duties could leave Pima County without dedicated nighttime aerial surveillance capability. That detail changed everything. Because for many people following the case later, the issue was no longer simply about a staffing decision. It became about a warning. A warning that critics say allegedly existed before the crisis ever unfolded. And psychologically, that distinction carries enormous weight. People can accept mistakes made during chaotic emergencies. But when concerns are reportedly raised beforehand, before anyone disappears, before search efforts begin, before public scrutiny intensifies, the story begins to feel different, more unsettling, more ominous. That is exactly why the grievance became such a focal point online. According to reports, Hossler had extensive experience tied to the department's aerial operations program. Public discussions described him as a longtime surveillance pilot connected to nighttime aviation capability involving infrared imaging technology and aerial search coordination. The department's aircraft, frequently referenced online as a Survey 1, reportedly carried advanced thermal imaging systems capable of detecting heat signatures across desert terrain after dark. Supporters of the aviation program viewed the aircraft as more than a patrol tool. According to discussions that emerged later, they viewed it as one of the county's most important nighttime search assets. And according to the reported grievance, concerns allegedly existed that the reassignment could affect that capability. Before Nancy disappeared, not after. That timeline would become central to growing public distrust. Because once the disappearance became national news, earlier events inside the department suddenly took on a completely different emotional meaning. What may once have looked like a departmental disagreement now appeared, to some observers, like a warning that failed to change anything. And that is where the deeper narrative surrounding the case truly began taking shape. Not around proof, not around direct evidence, but around the psychology of hindsight. Public discussions later focused heavily on one question. Did leadership fully understand the operational impact of the reassignment at the time the decision was made? Some online commentators argued that the grievance suggested internal concern had already been raised clearly. Others questioned whether the warning may have been viewed as exaggerated or administrative rather than operationally urgent. Some defended the department entirely, arguing there is no public evidence showing the county completely lost aerial capability or that the reassignment materially affected later search efforts. But uncertainty only fueled more speculation. Were the warnings taken seriously? Did decision-makers believe the concerns were overstated? Could critical nighttime search capability have been reduced at the worst possible moment? Or was the controversy later amplified unfairly simply because Nancy's disappearance remained unresolved? Those questions became deeply embedded in public discussion surrounding the case. A warning reportedly existed before the crisis ever began. But was it taken seriously? Or did hindsight transform an internal dispute into something far more unsettling? Subscribe to Apex Crime Files, because the deeper we go into this case, the more complicated the timeline becomes. Importantly, there is no public evidence connecting Richard Hossler's reassignment to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. There is also no public evidence suggesting Sheriff Chris Nanos or anyone inside the department anticipated what would happen days later. But despite those facts, critics continued revisiting the timeline because the sequence of events itself felt troubling to many observers. That is what made the story emotionally powerful online. The idea that operational concerns may have existed before the emergency created a sense of instability, a feeling that something inside the system may already have been under strain before the county faced a major missing persons case. And in true crime narratives, perceived instability often becomes just as compelling as confirmed evidence, because audiences begin asking themselves difficult questions. If the warning was real, why didn't it alter the decision? If nighttime aerial capability was considered important, why risk reducing it? Was this simply an unfortunate coincidence magnified by hindsight? Or did internal tensions inside the department unintentionally affect preparedness in ways nobody fully appreciated until afterward? Again, none of those questions establish wrongdoing, but they became impossible to separate from the growing public narrative surrounding the case. As discussions spread online, the grievance itself became symbolic. Symbolic of warnings allegedly ignored. Symbolic of internal conflict. Symbolic, for some critics, of a department that may already have been dealing with operational tension before Nancy disappeared. And once that narrative took hold publicly, every later development seemed to intensify it. Because the controversy did not emerge after search efforts failed to produce answers. It existed before Nancy vanished. That is the detail many people found hardest to ignore. The public conversation increasingly shifted from what happened after Nancy disappeared to what was already happening before she disappeared. That change in focus transformed the entire emotional direction of the case. Instead of viewing the reassignment as an isolated administrative issue, online investigators and commentators began analyzing it as part of a broader timeline. The grievance, the warning, the reassignment, the alleged reduction in nighttime surveillance capability. Each detail became another piece in a growing narrative centered around preparedness, leadership decisions, and whether critical resources may have been altered shortly before the county needed them most. Some online commentators went even further, speculating about whether the controversy reflected deeper dysfunction inside the department. Others strongly rejected those theories, arguing that internet speculation was turning incomplete information into unsupported suspicion. But the unresolved nature of the case only kept the questions alive, because uncertainty creates space for narratives to grow. And the longer Nancy remained missing, the more attention shifted toward events that occurred before the disappearance itself. Not because they proved anything, but because they felt significant, because they created doubt, because they introduced the haunting possibility that concerns may have existed before the crisis ever began. And in the minds of many observers following the case, that possibility changed how everything else was interpreted afterward. The reassignment was no longer viewed simply as a staffing dispute. The grievance was no longer viewed simply as internal paperwork. The warning was no longer viewed simply as a disagreement over operations. Together, they became something far more emotionally charged, a timeline that, fairly or unfairly, now appeared shadowed by hindsight. And once Nancy Guthrie vanished, the timing suddenly looked very different. Long before the controversy surrounding Richard Hossler's reassignment began spreading online, few people outside Pima County had likely ever heard of the department's surveillance aircraft. It was not the kind of machine the public regularly saw overhead, nor was it widely discussed outside law enforcement and aviation circles. But after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, that aircraft slowly became one of the most heavily debated symbols in the entire case. Because according to reports and public discussions surrounding the investigation, the aircraft was not an ordinary patrol plane. It was reportedly designed for one purpose above all else: locating people in places where visibility, terrain, and darkness work against search teams on the ground. And in the Arizona desert, darkness changes everything. By day, search terrain stretches endlessly across dry washes, rocky hillsides, cactus fields, and isolated roads. But at night, visibility collapses. Heat fades into the landscape. Tracks disappear. Distances become deceptive. Even experienced search teams can lose orientation in terrain that looks almost identical for miles. That is why aerial surveillance capability became such a major focus after Nancy vanished. According to public reports and online discussions, the department's aircraft, often referred to online as Survey 1, reportedly carried sophisticated thermal imaging systems capable of detecting infrared heat signatures from the sky. Critics later described it as one of the county's most advanced nighttime search tools, specifically because of its ability to operate in conditions where ordinary visibility becomes nearly useless. And that capability is what transformed the aircraft into something larger than technology. It became symbolic. Because once people began examining the timeline surrounding Nancy's disappearance, a haunting question started spreading online. What if one of the county's most advanced search tools had been unavailable during the most critical hours? That question would begin driving enormous public interest in the aircraft itself. Reports surrounding the surveillance system described infrared thermal imaging capable of detecting body heat against cooler desert terrain after sunset. Public discussions referenced long-range optics, live aerial feeds transmitted to units on the ground, and advanced nighttime search coordination systems designed to operate over wide areas for extended periods of time. The aircraft reportedly was not limited to short flights either. According to descriptions circulated publicly, it could remain airborne for hours while scanning terrain from high altitude. Some discussions described it as capable of quietly monitoring large search zones without ground teams even realizing how much territory was being covered overhead. To supporters of the aviation unit, the technology represented something critically important: time. In missing persons investigations, time is everything. Not because technology guarantees success, but because opportunities narrow quickly. Heat signatures cool. Footprints disappear. Vehicles move. Witnesses go home. Darkness reshapes the environment. And according to many online discussions surrounding the case, the first hours after Nancy Guthrie disappeared became central to the growing controversy over the aircraft. Importantly, no public evidence establishes that aerial deployment would have found Nancy or changed the outcome of the investigation. Search operations are extraordinarily difficult, especially across desert terrain, and even advanced surveillance systems have limitations. But critics repeatedly argued online that the issue was never certainty. It was possibility. Could aerial thermal imaging have narrowed the search area? Could infrared surveillance have identified movement invisible from the ground? Could earlier deployment have provided investigators with additional information during the critical early window? Or was the aircraft slowly becoming symbolic simply because the case remained unresolved? Those questions became deeply embedded in public conversation. And psychologically, the symbolism surrounding the aircraft became incredibly powerful. Because unlike many investigative controversies, this one came with imagery the public could immediately understand. A plane built for darkness. A surveillance system designed to detect heat. Technology reportedly capable of scanning isolated terrain from the sky. And according to critics, concerns about losing nighttime aerial capability had allegedly been raised before Nancy disappeared. That sequence transformed the aircraft into more than equipment. It became a representation of uncertainty itself. For some online investigators and commentators, the idea that such technology reportedly existed nearby while search efforts unfolded created an emotional tension difficult to ignore. Public discussions repeatedly focused on what the aircraft was allegedly capable of doing, especially during nighttime operations. Some online posts described how thermal systems can detect heat signatures against colder backgrounds after sunset. Others emphasized how aerial search units can cover massive sections of terrain far faster than ground teams moving through difficult desert conditions. Again, none of that proves the aircraft would have located Nancy Guthrie, but it fueled a growing what-if narrative that continued spreading online. What if the aircraft had been fully operational during those early hours? What if aerial thermal imaging had been deployed immediately? What if critical search capability had not reportedly been reduced days earlier? Could anything have been different? Or were people assigning too much meaning to the aircraft simply because they desperately wanted answers in an unsolved case? That uncertainty became the emotional engine driving public fascination. And the longer Nancy remained missing, the more symbolic the aircraft became. Not necessarily because of what it did, but because of what it represented. Preparation, capability, opportunity, and possibly, depending on who you asked online, lost time. Some critics framed the situation as an example of operational vulnerability inside the department. Others argued the controversy surrounding the aircraft had become exaggerated through internet speculation and hindsight bias. Defenders of the department pointed out that even sophisticated thermal systems are not miracle tools, and that missing persons cases frequently remain unresolved despite enormous search efforts. But those arguments did little to slow public interest in the aircraft itself. Because in true crime narratives, symbolism matters. And the image at the center of this story was haunting. An aircraft reportedly designed for nighttime search operations. An internal warning allegedly raised beforehand. A missing elderly woman. And a timeline that, fairly or unfairly, seemed increasingly difficult for some observers to separate from the controversy surrounding the surveillance capability. As online discussions intensified, some commentators even began referring to the aircraft less as a search tool and more as a missed opportunity. Not because anyone could prove what would have happened had it been deployed, but because uncertainty naturally fills the space where answers are absent. And uncertainty was everywhere in the Nancy Guthrie case. The aircraft eventually became a kind of psychological anchor for public frustration. Every unresolved question surrounding the disappearance seemed to pull attention back toward the same issue: preparedness before the crisis began. Did leadership fully appreciate the operational value of the aviation unit? Was the concern over nighttime capability underestimated? Did the reassignment controversy unintentionally reduce confidence in the department's readiness? Or had online speculation transformed an unfortunate coincidence into something emotionally larger than the facts themselves supported? Those questions remained unresolved, but the symbolism persisted. Because once people began imagining what the aircraft might have seen from above, heat signatures moving through darkness, isolated roads crossing desert terrain, hidden movement invisible from the ground, the machine itself became inseparable from the mystery. Not proof, not evidence, but possibility. And in unresolved cases, possibility can become almost as powerful as fact. especially when the timeline already feels unsettling. Because according to reports and public discussions, concerns over nighttime aerial surveillance capability allegedly existed before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. That is the detail critics kept returning to. Not because the aircraft guaranteed answers, but because once the case remained unsolved, every unavailable capability started feeling significant. Every lost hour started feeling heavier. Every earlier warning started sounding louder in hindsight. And for critics, the issue wasn't what the aircraft guaranteed. It was what opportunities may have been lost. In missing persons investigations, the first few hours often carry a weight that is difficult to explain to people who have never witnessed one unfold in real time. Before the headlines, before the social media theories, before the press conferences and online speculation, there is a brief window where everything still feels possible. Search teams can still follow fresh movement. Witnesses still remember details clearly. Heat signatures remain visible against cooling terrain. Vehicles may still be nearby. Footprints have not yet been erased by wind, darkness, or time. And according to many investigators and search professionals, once those early hours begin slipping away, the chances of finding answers can change rapidly. That is why the timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance became so heavily scrutinized afterward. Because by the time the public fully realized an 84-year-old woman was missing, many online observers believe the most critical period of the search may already have been disappearing with the night itself. Nancy Guthrie vanished under circumstances that would later fuel enormous public attention and speculation. But in those earliest moments, before the case became national conversation, investigators were facing the same problem that confronts nearly every missing persons case: uncertainty. Where do you search first? What direction do you prioritize? What information is reliable? How much time has already passed? And perhaps most importantly, in a case unfolding across Arizona terrain, what happens once darkness takes over? Because darkness changes the mathematics of a search completely. The desert at night is not merely difficult terrain. It becomes disorienting. Vast sections of open land begin looking identical. Visibility shrinks. Distances become deceptive. Ground search teams move slower, more cautiously, often forced to navigate terrain that is dangerous even in daylight. And while the public would later focus intensely on surveillance aircraft and thermal imaging systems, the deeper issue underneath those discussions was really about time. Time disappearing, opportunities narrowing, possibilities fading. According to public discussions that emerged after the disappearance, concerns over nighttime aerial surveillance capability had allegedly already been raised before Nancy vanished. Those earlier warnings suddenly became emotionally charged once the search began unfolding in real time. Because now the questions were no longer theoretical. Now someone was missing. Some online observers later questioned whether investigators may have lost valuable time during the earliest stages of the search. Others argued that hindsight was unfairly reshaping perceptions of an investigation operating under difficult and uncertain conditions. But regardless of perspective, the timeline itself became central to public scrutiny. Every hour mattered, and the public knew it. Reports and discussions surrounding the department's aerial surveillance program only intensified those concerns. According to descriptions circulated online, the aircraft associated with the department's aviation unit reportedly possessed nighttime infrared capability designed specifically for low-visibility operations. Supporters of the aviation unit argued that such systems were particularly valuable during the earliest hours of missing persons cases because heat signatures, movement patterns, and environmental indicators are often easier to detect before time and temperature erase them. Again, no public evidence establishes that aerial deployment would have found Nancy Guthrie or changed the outcome of the investigation. Search operations remain unpredictable even with advanced technology. But critics continued asking whether important search opportunities may have narrowed as time passed. Because time does not stand still in missing persons cases. Heat fades, tracks disappear, fresh movement becomes old movement. Potential sightings become impossible to verify. And once darkness fully settles across remote terrain, uncertainty multiplies. That growing sense of uncertainty became one of the defining emotional forces behind the public reaction to Nancy's disappearance. People began imagining the timeline minute by minute. What was happening during those first hours? What resources were immediately available? Were search systems fully operational? Had earlier staffing and aviation decisions now taken on larger significance than anyone initially realized? Or was the public unfairly connecting unrelated events simply because the case remained unresolved? Those questions spread rapidly online, because once an unsolved disappearance collides with earlier controversy, every missing answer starts feeling heavier. Some online commentators argued that the county's search readiness should have been stronger given the resources reportedly available to the department. Others defended investigators, pointing out that missing persons investigations are extraordinarily chaotic in their earliest phases and that even highly coordinated search operations often struggle against time, terrain, and incomplete information. But uncertainty kept feeding public fascination, especially surrounding the issue of nighttime capability. Because according to discussions surrounding the case, concerns about reduced nighttime aerial surveillance had allegedly existed before Nancy disappeared. That detail transformed later conversations about search readiness into something emotionally larger than a simple operational debate. For some observers, the issue became symbolic of preparedness itself. Did investigators have every available tool ready during the most critical window? Had earlier operational decisions unintentionally reduced flexibility during the search? Did leadership fully understand the consequences of losing specialized nighttime capability beforehand? Or were online discussions turning a tragic coincidence into something more suspicious than the evidence supported? There were no clear answers, and that absence of certainty became part of the story itself. The longer Nancy remained missing, the more public attention shifted backward toward the timeline leading into the disappearance. Earlier events inside the department, once viewed as isolated administrative matters, now seemed tied emotionally to the unfolding investigation. Not because evidence proved they were connected, but because the sequence itself felt haunting. An internal disagreement, a reported warning, concerns about nighttime aerial surveillance capability. Then an elderly woman disappears into difficult terrain. That progression became impossible for many online observers to ignore. And psychologically, the search itself amplified those feelings. Because every passing hour created more anxiety. Searches expanded. Public attention intensified. Questions multiplied. Yet certainty remained absent. Some observers later questioned whether investigators may have underestimated the importance of immediate nighttime search capability during those first crucial hours. Critics argued that aerial thermal imaging systems are often most effective before environmental conditions shift and before potential evidence begins disappearing naturally. Others strongly cautioned against assuming any technology could have guaranteed results in terrain as difficult and unpredictable as the Arizona desert. Whether it would have mattered remains unknown. But the public conversation surrounding the case increasingly focused not on guarantees, but on possibilities. Possibilities that could never be tested afterward. Possibilities that vanished alongside the passing hours. And that emotional tension became one of the most powerful aspects of the story. Because unresolved cases naturally create counterfactual thinking. People begin asking themselves, what if search efforts had started differently? What if resources had been deployed sooner? What if critical capability had remained fully available? What if those first hours had unfolded another way? Those questions may never have definitive answers. But once they enter public consciousness, they become difficult to silence. Especially in cases where earlier warnings reportedly existed before the emergency began. As discussions surrounding the investigation spread online, the issue of search readiness became increasingly tied to broader criticism surrounding the department itself. Some commentators framed the situation as evidence of deeper operational instability inside the sheriff's office. Others rejected those narratives completely, arguing that internet speculation was unfairly turning uncertainty into suspicion. But the unresolved nature of the case kept the debate alive, because uncertainty invites interpretation. And interpretation often grows fastest when time itself becomes part of the mystery. In the Nancy Guthrie case, time seemed to haunt every aspect of the public narrative. The time before the disappearance, the time during the first search efforts, the time between decisions and consequences, the time that could never be recovered afterward. And for many people following the case online, that became the most unsettling realization of all. Not necessarily that investigators failed, not necessarily that technology would have changed everything, but that in missing persons investigations, opportunities often disappear silently and permanently long before anyone fully understands their value. That is why the first hours mattered so much. And that is why the controversy surrounding earlier operational decisions continued growing alongside the search itself. Because once Nancy Guthrie vanished, every earlier warning sounded louder in hindsight. Every unavailable capability felt more significant. Every passing hour felt heavier. And as the search intensified, scrutiny of earlier decisions began growing online. At first, the controversy surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance appeared centered around one issue: the reported reassignment of veteran surveillance pilot Richard Hossler and the alleged reduction in nighttime aerial surveillance capability days before Nancy vanished. But as the investigation continued, public scrutiny began expanding far beyond the aircraft itself. Because the deeper people looked into the early stages of the case, the more uncertainty they believed they were finding. And slowly, the public narrative surrounding the disappearance began changing. This was no longer just about a grounded surveillance asset. Now people were questioning the investigation itself. Questions surrounding search readiness soon evolved into broader concerns about leadership decisions, conflicting information, and whether critical mistakes may have compounded during the earliest stages of the case. Online investigators, commentators, and true crime communities began revisiting nearly every reported detail connected to the timeline. And with every new discussion, the same feelings seemed to grow stronger. Something inside the investigation felt unstable. One of the biggest points of controversy involved reports that Nancy Guthrie's home had allegedly been released before forensic processing was fully completed. According to public discussions surrounding the investigation, critics argued that the decision raised concerns about whether potential evidence may have been lost or overlooked during the crucial early stages of the case. Importantly, no public evidence has established that the release of the home compromised the investigation or directly affected the outcome of the case. But once concerns surrounding the aircraft and nighttime surveillance capability had already entered public consciousness, later investigative decisions began receiving far more scrutiny than they otherwise might have. That is how public distrust often grows in unresolved cases. Not through one massive event, but through accumulation. One controversy becomes two become five, and suddenly the public is no longer debating isolated mistakes. They are debating confidence in the system itself. Some online observers later questioned why the home was reportedly released when the investigation was still developing. Others argued that decisions surrounding crime scene management are often more complicated than the public realizes, and that internet commentary frequently oversimplifies investigative procedure. But uncertainty remained. And uncertainty creates space for narrative escalation. As discussions intensified online, critics increasingly focused on what they viewed as conflicting timelines and inconsistent public messaging during the early stages of the investigation. Different statements, evolving details, and changing understandings of events began fueling speculation that investigators themselves may not have fully understood what had happened during the earliest hours after Nancy disappeared. Again, public criticism does not establish wrongdoing, and no evidence has publicly proven intentional misconduct by Sheriff Chris Nanos or members of the Pima County Sheriff's Department. But unresolved questions continued multiplying, and psychologically, that matters. Because once the public begins perceiving inconsistency, even ordinary investigative uncertainty can start looking suspicious. That dynamic became one of the defining forces shaping the Nancy Guthrie case online. People were no longer focused solely on Nancy's disappearance. Now they were analyzing the investigation surrounding the disappearance, examining statements, comparing timelines, revisiting early decisions, questioning preparedness, questioning communication, questioning leadership. And with each new layer of scrutiny, earlier controversies became even more emotionally charged in hindsight. The reported grievance involving nighttime aerial surveillance no longer felt like a separate issue. The aircraft no longer felt like a standalone controversy. Instead, many online observers began interpreting everything together as part of a larger pattern of instability surrounding the investigation's earliest stages. Whether that interpretation was fair became deeply debated. Some commentators argued that the public was unfairly transforming normal investigative complexity into conspiracy-driven suspicion. Others believe the growing list of acknowledged mistakes and unanswered questions justified increasing public scrutiny of department leadership. But the criticism kept escalating, partly because the case remained unresolved. And unresolved cases naturally amplify every inconsistency. Every unclear timeline becomes important. Every correction becomes suspicious. Every missing answer creates room for new theories, especially online. According to public discussions surrounding the investigation, Sheriff Chris Nanos himself reportedly acknowledged certain early investigative missteps as criticism intensified. For some observers, those acknowledgments reinforced concerns that the early response may not have unfolded as smoothly as initially presented publicly. For others, the willingness to acknowledge mistakes demonstrated transparency rather than misconduct. But by that point, public perception had already begun shifting. Because once confidence starts weakening in a high-profile missing persons case, restoring it becomes extraordinarily difficult. And the unresolved nature of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance only deepened that problem. As search efforts continued without clear answers, online investigators and commentators increasingly revisited earlier operational decisions through a much darker lens. The reassignment controversy, the grievance, the alleged warning, the release of the home, the evolving timelines. Each new issue seemed to reinforce earlier concerns already circulating publicly. This wasn't just about one decision anymore. That became the emotional turning point in the public narrative. The story was no longer confined to, was the aircraft available? Now it had expanded into, was the investigation itself fully under control during those critical early hours? That shift dramatically changed how audiences interpreted everything afterward. Because once broader distrust enters a case, every unanswered question begins connecting emotionally to every earlier controversy. Some online commentators began asking whether multiple small mistakes may have compounded into larger investigative problems. Others questioned whether leadership decisions made before and after the disappearance may have unintentionally weakened public confidence in the department's handling of the case. Did earlier operational tensions affect preparedness? Did communication problems create confusion during the investigation? Were investigative decisions being made too quickly during the earliest stages? Or was public perception being distorted by the pressure and uncertainty surrounding a deeply emotional missing persons case? There were no easy answers, but the absence of clarity became part of the narrative itself. And in true crime storytelling, narratives built around uncertainty often grow more powerful over time rather than weaker. Because people begin searching for meaning inside confusion. That process became increasingly visible online as amateur investigators, commentators, and social media communities dissected every available detail connected to the case. Discussions spread rapidly across platforms. Timelines were reconstructed. Statements were compared side by side. Small inconsistencies became focal points for larger debates about competence, preparedness, and leadership. Importantly, none of those discussions publicly established criminal wrongdoing. That distinction matters enormously, because public criticism and online suspicion are not evidence. And no publicly available information has proven that investigative mistakes intentionally occurred or that anyone inside the department deliberately mishandled the case. But perception does not always operate according to legal standards, especially online. Once distrust begins forming publicly, perception often moves faster than facts themselves. And that is exactly what appeared to happen as scrutiny surrounding the Nancy Guthrie investigation intensified. The unresolved disappearance created emotional pressure. The earlier controversies created suspicion. The acknowledged missteps created doubt. And together, those elements formed something far larger than any single mistake viewed in isolation. A growing belief among some observers that the investigation may have suffered from deeper instability during the most critical period of the case. Again, that belief remains heavily debated. But it became impossible to ignore how quickly criticism surrounding department leadership continued spreading once multiple controversies became attached to the timeline. Because people were no longer asking only, what happened to Nancy? Now they were asking, what happened inside the investigation itself? And that question changed everything. The public conversation surrounding the case slowly transformed from a missing persons investigation into something broader and emotionally heavier. a debate about preparedness, operational decisions, leadership confidence, and whether crucial opportunities may have been lost during the earliest hours after Nancy disappeared. As that shift occurred, every earlier detail gained new emotional significance. The reassignment controversy sounded more serious. The grievance sounded more urgent. The release of the home sounded more questionable. The changing timelines sounded more troubling. Whether those perceptions were fully justified remained unclear. But the psychological impact on public trust was undeniable. Because once people start believing mistakes may be compounding on top of each other, confidence erodes rapidly. And in unresolved investigations, eroded confidence often becomes part of the mystery itself. For many online observers, the case was beginning to feel larger than a disappearance alone. In the early days of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the public conversation remained relatively focused on the search itself. People wanted updates, sightings, evidence, progress. Like most missing persons cases, the hope in those first moments was that answers would emerge quickly and bring clarity before speculation had time to grow. But clarity never fully came. And in modern true crime cases, when answers fail to appear, something else inevitably takes their place. Narratives. Not official narratives. Public narratives. Internet narratives. And once those narratives begin forming online, they often spread faster than verified information itself. That is exactly what began happening in the Nancy Guthrie case. As days passed without resolution, social media communities started reconstructing the timeline independently. Online investigators, true crime commentators, and viral discussion threads began revisiting every reported detail connected to the disappearance. Earlier controversies that may once have seemed isolated suddenly became interconnected in the public imagination. The reassignment of Richard Hossler, the reported grievance, concerns over nighttime aerial surveillance capability, the release of Nancy's home, the changing timelines, the acknowledged investigative missteps. Each detail became another point inside a growing network of suspicion and unanswered questions, and the internet began connecting the dots, not necessarily through evidence, but through perception. That distinction became incredibly important as online discussions surrounding the case intensified, because in unresolved investigations, perception often moves faster than certainty. People start filling gaps, searching for patterns, comparing timelines, looking for meaning inside confusion. And the longer uncertainty continues, the stronger those psychological connections become. According to public discussions surrounding the case, one of the biggest drivers of online suspicion became timing itself. Viral posts and discussion threads repeatedly focused on the sequence of events that occurred before Nancy disappeared. The alleged warning regarding nighttime aerial surveillance capability reportedly existed before the search ever began. The reassignment controversy reportedly unfolded before the disappearance. Questions surrounding operational readiness allegedly existed before the public even realized a major missing persons case was developing. That sequence became emotionally powerful online, because to many observers, it no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like build-up. Again, no public evidence supports theories of intentional wrongdoing by Sheriff Chris Nanos or members of the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Many online claims remain speculative and unverified. But once unresolved cases collide with earlier controversy, the internet naturally begins constructing larger narratives around the timeline. And those narratives can become difficult to control. Some online investigators focused heavily on the aircraft itself, reposting descriptions of thermal imaging systems and nighttime surveillance capability while questioning whether critical search resources had been reduced shortly before Nancy vanished. Others concentrated more on the broader investigation, analyzing public statements, comparing reported timelines, and debating whether earlier decisions reflected deeper operational instability inside the department. Soon, social media threads analyzing the case began spreading across platforms. Screenshots circulated, timelines were recreated, comments exploded beneath news clips and public statements. People who had never met Nancy Guthrie began debating aviation procedures, search protocol, forensic timing, and leadership decisions inside the sheriff's department. And with every passing day, the line between confirmed information and public interpretation became harder for some audiences to separate. That is one of the defining characteristics of internet-driven true crime culture. Information no longer moves slowly. It mutates. Every unanswered question creates new theories. Every ambiguity creates new suspicion. Every correction creates fresh debate. And because Nancy Guthrie's disappearance remained unresolved, the online narrative surrounding the case continued expanding outward. Some observers later questioned whether earlier warnings regarding surveillance capability had been underestimated by department leadership. Others argued the internet was unfairly transforming ordinary operational disagreements into something darker simply because people were desperate for answers. But desperation itself often fuels speculation, especially when timelines feel emotionally unsettling. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, the timing continued haunting public discussion. 3 days before the disappearance, a reassignment controversy reportedly unfolded involving the county's aviation unit. A grievance was allegedly filed warning of reduced nighttime aerial capability. Then Nancy vanished. That progression became central to countless online conversations. Not because it proved anything, but because unresolved events naturally invite interpretation. Some online commentators argued the department may not have fully recognized operational vulnerabilities before the disappearance occurred. Others questioned whether the public was assigning too much significance to unrelated events simply because the case lacked clear answers. And without resolution, neither side could definitively silence the other. That uncertainty kept the online narrative alive. As discussions intensified, the internet began treating the case less like a missing persons investigation and more like an unfolding institutional mystery. The focus gradually expanded beyond Nancy herself and toward broader questions surrounding leadership, preparedness, communication, and public trust. Why did earlier warnings allegedly fail to change operational decisions? Why did multiple controversies emerge around the same timeline? Were investigative mistakes compounding public distrust? Or was social media simply magnifying uncertainty into suspicion? Those questions became central to online discourse surrounding the case. And psychologically, the internet's role in shaping perception became enormous. Because online communities do not analyze cases the same way investigators do. Investigators search for provable facts. The internet searches for patterns. And patterns can feel convincing even when they remain incomplete. That is why the Nancy Guthrie case became so emotionally compelling online. The aircraft controversy alone created intrigue. But once additional questions surrounding investigative decisions emerged, many observers began interpreting every new detail through a growing framework of distrust. The reassignment no longer looked isolated. The grievance no longer looked administrative. The missteps no longer looked independent. Everything started appearing connected. Again, perception is not proof. And no public evidence has established intentional misconduct by anyone involved in the investigation. But online narratives rarely grow because people feel certain. They grow because people feel unresolved. That emotional unresolvedness became the driving force behind the internet's obsession with the timeline surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Some commentators openly speculated that earlier operational decisions may have unintentionally weakened search readiness. Others argued that internet speculation was becoming dangerously detached from verified evidence. Debates intensified across social media, with some users defending the department while others viewed the growing list of controversies as evidence of deeper instability. But the longer the case remained unresolved, the harder it became to slow the spread of suspicion. Because uncertainty creates momentum online. Every missing answer invites another theory. Every silence invites interpretation. And every unresolved timeline invites people to search backward for the moment where everything may have gone wrong. For many online investigators, that backward search always seemed to return to the same place. The days before Nancy disappeared. That became the emotional center of the internet narrative. Not necessarily what happened after the disappearance, but what was already happening beforehand. The reassignment, the grievance, the operational concerns, the reported warnings, the alleged reduction in nighttime aerial capability. Whether those events ultimately mattered remains unknown. But because they existed before the disappearance itself, they carried enormous psychological weight online. And once that perception took hold publicly, every new development seemed to reinforce it further. The unresolved search deepened suspicion. The investigative missteps deepened distrust. The timeline deepened obsession. Some online observers began viewing the case as an example of how institutional instability, operational controversy, and communication failures can rapidly erode public confidence during high-profile investigations. Others warned that internet speculation was unfairly transforming incomplete information into narratives unsupported by evidence. Both perspectives continued colliding online. And meanwhile, Nancy Guthrie remained missing. That unresolved absence became the force pulling every controversy together. Because if the case had ended quickly with clear answers, many of the earlier disputes may never have gained national attention. But unresolved cases change the emotional meaning of everything around them, especially timing. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, timing became almost impossible for the internet to stop analyzing. Because once enough people begin believing earlier warnings may have existed before a crisis unfolded, every later mistake starts feeling larger in hindsight. Every unexplained decision starts looking heavier. Every inconsistency starts sounding louder. Not necessarily because wrongdoing occurred, but because uncertainty changes how people interpret events. And the longer Nancy remained missing, the harder it became for some people to dismiss the timing. In the end, the Nancy Guthrie case became about far more than a missing persons investigation. It became about timing, about trust, about preparedness, about the uneasy space between what can be proven and what continues haunting public perception long after the facts stop moving. And at the center of that unease sat an aircraft that, according to critics, never left the ground when it mattered most. For many people following the case online, that image became impossible to forget. Not because the aircraft guaranteed answers, not because thermal imaging technology could magically solve a disappearance, but because unresolved cases often attach themselves to symbols. And in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the surveillance aircraft slowly transformed into something larger than equipment. It became symbolic of uncertainty itself, a machine reportedly designed for darkness, a system allegedly built to locate movement across difficult terrain, an asset connected to warnings that, according to public discussions, may have existed before Nancy disappeared. And then, suddenly, an 84-year-old woman vanishes. That sequence became the emotional backbone of the public narrative surrounding the case. Not necessarily because evidence proved the aircraft would have changed anything, but because people could not stop imagining the possibility. What if earlier decisions had unfolded differently? What if nighttime aerial capability had remained fully operational? What if the first hours of the search had looked different from above? Could anything have changed? Or was the aircraft becoming symbolic simply because the case itself remained unresolved? Those questions never fully disappeared. And the longer Nancy remained missing, the more emotionally charged they became. Because unresolved investigations have a way of transforming ordinary decisions into permanent points of speculation. Every earlier controversy gains weight. Every unanswered question expands. Every inconsistency becomes part of a larger story the public keeps trying to solve long after official information slows down. That is exactly what happened here. The reassignment controversy surrounding Richard Hossler stopped feeling like an isolated staffing dispute. The grievance stopped feeling like internal paperwork. The concerns over nighttime aerial capability stopped sounding procedural. Together, fairly or unfairly, they became part of a narrative about preparedness before crisis. And once that narrative takes hold publicly, it becomes incredibly difficult to separate emotion from evidence. Importantly, no public evidence has established that the reassignment of Hossler or the reported reduction in nighttime aerial surveillance capability caused or contributed to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. No evidence publicly supports theories of intentional wrongdoing by Sheriff Chris Nanos or members of the Pima County Sheriff's Department. That distinction matters, because public suspicion is not proof. Online narratives are not evidence, and unresolved questions alone do not establish misconduct. But emotionally, uncertainty does something powerful to people, especially in true crime cases. People begin searching backward through timelines looking for the moment where events may have shifted, the moment where opportunity may have narrowed, the moment where decisions that once seemed ordinary suddenly began feeling important in hindsight. And for many online observers, that moment appeared to arrive days before Nancy vanished. The reassignment. the reported warning, the grievance, the alleged concern over nighttime aerial capability, then the disappearance. That sequence remained psychologically difficult for many people to dismiss, not because it established guilt, but because timing itself became part of the mystery. And timing is often what true crime audiences become obsessed with most. Not merely what happened, but when it happened. Why it happened then? Why certain decisions unfolded before the crisis? Why certain warnings allegedly existed beforehand? Whether those warnings mattered at all, or whether the human mind simply struggles to accept coincidence once tragedy enters the timeline. That tension became the emotional core of the entire case. Because eventually, the story stopped being solely about Nancy Guthrie. It became about institutional confidence, about whether the public trusted leadership decisions during the most critical moments of an investigation, about whether earlier operational concerns had been fully understood, about whether multiple controversies, viewed together, reflected something larger than isolated mistakes. Some online commentators argued the public was unfairly building narratives from incomplete information. Others believed the growing list of controversies justified ongoing scrutiny of the department and Sheriff Chris Nanos himself. Neither side fully convinced the other. And because the case remained unresolved, the uncertainty survived. That uncertainty spread into every aspect of public discussion surrounding the investigation. The aircraft became symbolic of missed opportunity. The reassignment became symbolic of ignored warning signs. The acknowledged investigative missteps became symbolic of instability. And together, those symbols created a public narrative far larger than the original disappearance alone. A narrative about whether systems designed to respond during emergencies were fully prepared when the emergency finally arrived. That is what made the case resonate so deeply online. Because beneath every discussion about thermal imaging, surveillance capability, and operational decisions was a much more human fear. What if critical opportunities disappear before anyone realizes their importance? That fear shaped nearly every conversation surrounding the case. As public trust weakened, people began interpreting new information through the lens of earlier controversy. Investigative uncertainty started feeling suspicious. Delays felt heavier. Corrections felt more significant. Even silence itself began feeding speculation. Again, none of that proves wrongdoing. But perception often evolves independently from evidence, especially online. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, perception eventually became almost inseparable from the mystery itself. The unresolved disappearance left emotional space for narratives to grow. The earlier controversies gave those narratives structure, and the internet connected everything together into a timeline many observers found increasingly unsettling. Still, the central question remained unanswered. Was the controversy ultimately meaningless? Was the reassignment simply an unfortunate coincidence magnified by hindsight and internet speculation? Did public frustration attach itself to the aircraft because people desperately needed something concrete to focus on in an otherwise uncertain case? Or did earlier operational decisions quietly shape the first hours of the search in ways that can never fully be measured afterward? No one publicly knows. And perhaps that uncertainty is why the case continues lingering in public consciousness long after the initial headlines faded. Because the mystery was never just. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Over time, it became. What happened inside the system before she disappeared? That shift changed everything. The conversation expanded beyond a missing persons case and into something broader and more unsettling. A public examination of preparedness, leadership, communication, and trust during moments where every hour matters. And throughout all of it, one image continued resurfacing online again and again. The aircraft. Maybe the aircraft meant nothing. Maybe the timing was simply tragic coincidence. Or maybe some questions only grow louder when answers never come. Subscribe to Apex Crime Files for more deep investigative breakdowns into the cases, controversies, and timelines that continue haunting the internet long after the headlines fade. The surveillance platform reportedly capable of scanning darkness from above. The machine connected to earlier warnings and operational controversy. The aircraft critics say remained grounded while uncertainty spread across the desert below. Whether that image reflects reality or merely public perception remains deeply debated. But symbolism rarely depends entirely on proof. Sometimes symbolism grows from absence. from unanswered questions, from possibilities that can never be tested afterward. And perhaps that is why the Nancy Guthrie case continues haunting so many people who followed it online. Not because the public definitively knows what happened, but because they do not. Because there are still questions without answers, warnings without resolution, timelines without certainty, and a disappearance that transformed every earlier decision into something emotionally impossible to fully separate from what came next. Will the truth ever fully be known? Maybe, maybe not. But for many people following the case, one detail continues echoing louder than the rest. The aircraft never left the ground.